Scandinavia has made few notable contributions to the world, Lego, IKEA and ABBA, but there's something that I think is much more important and not as well known. The folk high school or the folk school. It's a Scandinavian model for education with origins and some sort of relation with 19th century reception of Nordic heathendom. But what is the folk school? How does it impact the world and how does it align with indigenous knowledge? Welcome to the Nordic Animism channel, where I apply contemporary animist thinking to try to open decolonial paths towards traditional North European knowledge. Please remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to support us on Patreon. So Niels Frederik Severin Grundtvig was a Danish pastor, author, educator, constitutional father, politician, poet, translator, researcher, mythologist, lyricist, thinker, Democrat, but also royalist, conservative, yes, also super progressive, patriarchal, but also kind of feminist, nationalist, but weirdly culturally inclusive, devoted Christian, yet also kind of sort of heathen, conundrum of a man. Unquestionably one of the most important figures in Danish history and key in shaping Scandinavian societies. I've detailed Grundtvig's relationship to heathendom in a previous video, and I'll still touch on it a little bit here, but check that out for a fuller picture. What is perhaps most relevant here is how difficult Grundtvig has been to place politically. He lived more than 90 years, born into a time where noblemen dueled with rapiers, and died in a time where he could be photographed in a democratic state. His legacy is very marked by nationalism, but it has also gone abroad and then been decidedly on the right side of history. In 2016, when the American president Barack Obama received a delegation of Scandinavian prime ministers, he credited Grundtvig's folk school model as a contribution to the American civil rights movement.
They were all shaped in part by Highlander and the teachings of a great Nordic philosopher. And they ended up having a ripple effect on the civil rights movement and ultimately on making America a better place.
Grundtvig's cultural contribution could be seen as a reaction to three dominant situations of his day. The emergence of democracy as a response to caste feudalism, the collapse of the Dano-Norwegian realm, an empire aspiring North Sea state controlled from Copenhagen, and the imminent threat as the Dano-Norwegian realm collapsed, the Danes would then be gobbled up by the German Empire, and our culture and language would have been erased. Grundtvig's response was education. Education aimed at bringing people into cultural identity and political consciousness. And in the 19th century, that meant a rather vulgar nationalism and romanticism. But it is important to still acknowledge the socially positive effects of the overall management of knowledge that the folk school brought, and that nationalism at the time also had some progressive aspects comparable to what we sometimes see in current situations of indigenous empowerment. At the time, this focus on cultural identity aimed to bring low-caste plebeians into ethnic identity. Peasants were seen as deeply inferior, lazy, stupid, morally backwards, even physically inferior. But Grundtvig's romanticism took the traditional life form and elevated it to an ideal. But for Grundtvig, this didn't just rest in the space of nostalgic reverie. Grundtvig wanted to shape the oppressed lower caste into a people, inspired by the German thinkers of the folk. Now that people that would later become racial, but he took this in a somewhat different direction than the German folk, which became very toxic later in history. That didn't turn that bad in Scandinavia. For Grundtvig, it was your belief in your belonging that defined you as part of the people. Grundtvig also defined the relation to other as a core principle in the realization of the people. And this isn't to say that there hasn't been racism in Denmark. There certainly has been. It's just to say that the notion of the people, the folk, is not inherently tied to racism as it was to German nationalists who would later produce National Socialism. Unlike most pastors of his age, Grundtvig detested anti-Semitism. He actually wrote psalms, hymns, written for the purpose of Jews and Christians singing them together. And this little Norse mythology school book that my Grundtvigian grandmother used to read to me as a child, it begins admonishing children to appreciate the contribution of Jews to world history. There's a long tradition in Denmark, for instance, of socialists owning the idea of the people, the folk. Social democrats, particularly, realized at an early point that you couldn't let fascists own the idea of the sovereign people. And it's important to make this point when you communicate in English. Here, the folk is not that Nazi concept that you might associate with the word in English. I vote at a folk parliament. As a child, I went to a folk school, and I can go up to my folk library even through the internet. Click me wanty, and some days later I get an email that I can pick up a book at my local library. Here, for instance, I ordered Grundtvig's Mythology of the North. It just arrived, and when I opened the book, I realized that it's actually a 200-year-old first edition. That is Nordic socialism when it works. So how was folk school knowledge communicated? And this is what struck me some time back and made me basically start looking into Grundtvig a little bit. That the model for learning or co-learning is actually surprisingly aligned with Indigenous knowledge. A folk school should be oral. The living word was based on Grundtvig's idea that the spoken word was where truth and divinity resided, not in writing. And this was especially true of singing. So singing came to take a central role as students would come together and live, typically for a year, on a folk school. This would also shape their identity, by the way, because they formed a community around this learning. A folk school should have teachers that inspire. Teachers must yield some sort of charisma and light the flame in the students. Grundtvig was interested in the balance between the universal and the particular, and between community and freedom. So his movement is characterized by charismatic teachers, while also have a strong focusing on community. A folk school should be culturally rooted. The folk school haven't traveled that much outside Scandinavia, but when it does, it must spring from local culture. Grundtvig was a Christian pastor, but he was very cognizant of the sides of life that were not Christian. One of his famous sayings include, "Human first, then Christian." A folk school should not have grades and exams. Grundtvig detested exams and grading systems and all that. It was completely rejected in the folk school system. We acquire knowledge because knowledge is amazing, and developing it in community with other people, that is one of the most rewarding human experiences that you can have. Learning should be enjoyable. We don't study to get grades or diplomas and all that. Teaching should be narrative. It should even be poetic. Mythopoetic. Grundtvigians are a very early case of a wide and popular valorization of pre-Christian myth in Scandinavia, and I'm talking about that in another video. And teaching should be in your own language. This was surprisingly radical in Grundtvig's age. Nobles spoke French, maybe German, to their fine pedigree hunting dogs. They barely debased themselves to speak Danish to their slave-like peasants that toiled their fields. And formal education was exclusively communicated in Latin. To that, Grundtvig's position was, fuck that shit. Our language is important, it's beautiful, it's poetic, it has a tradition of knowledge connected to it. School should be without violence. A really important principle was to not use violence when teaching children. And I'm not sure exactly how early this took roots among Grundtvigians, but My grandparents, for instance, had a very strong reaction when a teacher in the local public school had beaten my aunt as a child. And this was in the 1950s, where corporal punishment was absolutely standard procedure. But being Grundtvigians, my parents took the kids out of school and created their own little Grundtvigian free school for the kids and their neighbors. And this is true Grundtvigian culture. Notice that these people are peasants. They're rural people. They're farmers, but they're also fiercely self-conscious and ahead of their time. They use an education model that focuses on social change. So what became of this movement? Women's liberation in Denmark took off from the folk school movement. Grundtvig was fervently on this team, and he spearheaded women as part of the people. So women's folk schools emerged, as did other movements that adopted the model. A workers' movement, also Bible fundamentalists, later on the hippie movement. But interestingly, fascism never got into the folk school movement. I think the contradiction is simply too stark. Running a folk school in a fascist way isn't running a folk school. You can't even run a folk school like you run a university. A university is far too rigid in its structure and too focused on quantifying output and so on. Many believe that the co-op movement took off from the folk school movement. The reason that it didn't take off in England, where it was invented, but that it did take off like a wildfire in Denmark and came to our entire economy, is Grundtvigianism. Also, a huge mycelium of associations emerged from this culture of grassroots organizing. Denmark is an extreme example. This country has more associations per capita than any other country in the world. Another monumental example is the land rights movement that really kicked ass. In the early 20th century, far too much land was concentrated on far too few hands in Denmark. So the small farmers movement arose and made the cause for redistribution of land through parliament. The largest states took this to Supreme Court. They're stealing our stuff. But the Supreme Court supported the democratic decision, and a third of the wealth of the elite was confiscated and redistributed. I try to contemplate what this would look like today, confiscating and redistributing a third of the value belonging to elites. Hello, Elon. I think that part of the reason that the radicalism of this is not really appreciated today is that we've forgotten that this is what created our world here in Scandinavia, and it is what our grandparents were doing, so it doesn't really seem all that sexy. My friend here, the metamodernist thinker Lene Rakel Andersen, who has written this book here on the Nordic secret, she builds a strong case that is this way of handling knowledge, rooted in the Grundtvigian tradition, that is why Scandinavia is so relatively successful in a number of social and economic parameters. So the folk school movement did not travel out of Scandinavia so much. There are some examples though. You find folk schools in Poland, Japan, Hungary, some cases in Africa. In the mid-20th century, a Grundtvigian folk college was built in India. Gandhi was involved because of its anti-imperialist and anti-racist efforts. Grundtvigianism is predicated on valorizing the culture of a place, so this school very quickly became Hindu rather than Christian. There was a Jewish Grundtvigian named Shulamit Katz-Nilsson who started a folk school in Israel that taught Jews Arabic and Palestinians Hebrew and so on. It was part of the peace process. But the most notable story is probably the US. Although the model was first introduced by Danish immigrants and they were a bit too immersed in their nostalgia for their own old country and so on, so it didn't really take root. The real development was through Americans themselves, who made the movement truly American. The socialist Miles Horton had gone to Denmark in the 1930s to study the folk school movement. When he returned to the US, he founded the Highlander Folk School, a Grundtvigian high school in the dirt-poor Appalachian Mountains. This school became pivotal to the American Civil Rights Movement. Incredibly important people came through the milieu around this school. Woody Guthrie, Peter Seeger, Ralph Abernathy, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Rosa Parks later said that her time at this folk school was all-defining for her involvement in the movement. The college was wildly controversial for its racial inclusivity and mixing, and in the end it was attacked and closed by forces aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. So here in Scandinavia, indigenous groups have also applied this model. There are Sami folk colleges in both Norway, Sweden and Finland. In fact, my own folk college experience was at the Sami folk college in Karasjokka in Norwegian Sápmi. Now I think that the Nordic folk school could basically be seen almost as an spontaneous emergence of a model very closely allied with indigenous knowledge practice. Of course, under the conditions and under the limitations defined by that age. There are features that I think are strikingly similar to the indigenous theory of learning, for instance suggested by the Aboriginal Australian thinker Tyson Yunkaporta, specifically what he calls yarning, which is this model for sharing knowledge that is based on communal, respectful, free, open, associating dialogue. The focus is learning together in a community, not tearing someone down in a one-to-one classroom debate. In the folk school model, as in Tyson's idea of indigenous knowledge, knowledge should be local, it should be oral, especially with an emphasis on singing. It should be narrative, focusing on mythology, and it should be enjoyable. Grundtvig called this a school for life, as opposed to the school for death. And I'm pretty sure that Grundtvig would have heartily agreed with Tyson's description of Western education systems. There's even a little bit of the same sort of radically jolly judgmentalism in Tyson's and Grundtvig's critique of the conventional education systems. Tyson sees it as a weaponizing of boredom, you know. Grundtvig rails about how it destroys people in all kinds of ways. He basically says that conventional schools are much, much worse than nothing. Children should be taught at home. Now, Nordic Animism is a project whose main objective is to change and renew culture in dialogue with the culture of the past. So I think it may be a very valuable effort to bring the folk college model into fusion with contemporary ideas of indigenous knowledge. The model will change, of course. I'm not a big fan of Christianity, but if you are, then knock yourself out. Nationalism, however, I think that one should go down the drain, at least when we're talking about majority populations. It is a bit of a different story if you're from a minority group. I've spoken about that elsewhere, but I'll also just say that there's something to suggest that this model could yield a great potential in indigenous empowerment. I think for majorities, this model would be best used to spearhead other modes of connectivity and self-image that we need today. The original forms of community in the folk school model sprung from Christian nationalism and modernity, and that might be the reason that animist connectivity has historically not been centered in the movement. It's almost like traditional knowledge, but without the essence, the animism, the connectivity. And therefore the movement hasn't worked on extending community to the other than human. Perhaps you could even say the opposite, that animism has been domesticated by becoming this sort of pastiche, this identitarian interest in stuff like Nordic mythology as some sort of nationalist window dressing for your cathartically self-fulfilled cult of your own ethnic essence. People didn't build relation to thunder. They just kind of wallowed in a mythopoetic nostalgia for their own cultural identity. And this is very visible here in Denmark. The Danish peasantry that came out of the folk school movement was not connected to the land in an animist sense. They came with innovative efficiency and the will to organize themselves and make it their own world, you know. And so they did. They plowed down ancient grave mounds. They bred pigs to have an extra rib for more bacon. They produced 30 million pigs for slaughter per year. 1 million kilometers of draining pipes have changed a paradise of wetlands and bogs and meadows into a hellscape of perfectly square patches of monocultural agriculture production. This is the lack of animism. But we have also seen that this tradition is incredibly transformative. It's almost too transformative to be called a movement. It's almost like a method that different movements can use. I think different groups have different contributions to our time, and if we get beyond silly nationalist ideas that want to seclude methods of interaction with the world into specific groups, then we do have the tools that we need. We need strong counter-modern tools of allowing strong animism to persist. We need the culture, the practice, and the thinking that brings us back into relation with our landscapes and its other inhabitants. And I think that the Nordics have a tool for that, and that's the folk school model. That is something that we can really contribute with. Now, in an ideal world, we would have more physical proximity, so people could actually meet, sing together, importantly, get to know each other properly. And I encourage all well-meaning, respectful people to look at the Nordic folk school model for empowerment in your local environments. Unfortunately, I do not have the means to host a traditional folk school here in Denmark, at least for now. And I suspect that many of you would not have the means to attend an in-person folk school in Denmark. So I've done my best to replicate this model online. This course will be available from September. More details will be available in the coming weeks on my website and also on my social media pages. So thank you for your support. Keep an eye out for course updates and see you around.